Gaming Act, but also on sectors like taxis, private hire vehicles, operators, animal boarders, street traders. All of them will have been affected to a greater or lesser extent by basically the economic impact of the pandemic and the restrictions that have been put in place, particularly restrictions around hospitality, nighttime economy, and people working more from home and not travelling, which obviously basically all of those things rely on various aspects of the licence sector. So the report before you tonight basically sets out the proposed fees and charges, a bit of background to those fees and charges with a number of recommendations. I think at that point, unless there's questions, I think I'll stop there and leave it to the committee basically to ask me anything or to ask for clarification or discuss any points.
Okay, thank you, Sean. So we've got three recommendations. The first refers to the actual licensing fees in Appendix C. You can turn to Appendix C. Perhaps we just go through those. There's obviously several pages. I got to the top of it. The yellow bits are set by the government, so we can't change those. I can't remember having done this in the past, but we'll just go down the list page by page. Perhaps if members want to raise their hand, if there are points they wish to ask questions on. I can do two things. I have a hand up for Rachel Burgess. So Rachel, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. The first question I had was about the overall basis for most of these, which is the hourly rate. Now, it says there'd been an internal review of that hourly rate, but as we've said at quite a number of previous meetings, there was an internal audit recommendation back in September 2019 to actually review the hourly rate fully and the basis of it. And now that's been promised to this committee a number of times. I believe the preliminary findings of that were supposed to be brought to this meeting. So could we have an update on that, please? Because it's hard to actually, for us to be endorsing this if we haven't had that internal audit recommendation actually actioned. Just a secondary point on the hourly rate as well. If we do have we have a standard hourly rate for all licenses, is there actually an argument that we're sort of cross-subsidising some areas of licensing with others, because some will cost more than that because they'll be more sort of specific or difficult, and some will cost less? So could you say a bit about that, and whether actually that's okay within the sort of regulations that we can do that, and that's quite a standard way of doing it?
Okay, Sean, can you pick that up?
Yeah, Chair, if I may, this is the point at which I would like to call on Paul Anstey, who has done the work around the hourly rate and the review and basically the detail that Councillor Burgess is talking about. So if I may hand over to Paul, if that's okay.
Yes, please. Thanks, Sean. Good evening, Paul.
Good evening, Chairman. Yes, I'll attempt to pick up on those points in sequence. So the starting point is that having a generic hourly rate has been something that was put together in order for us to, one, establish what the cost base is for the service as a whole, and for us to compare the cost base against the number of people that we've got operating in the service, and to make sure that in any activity that we conduct, that we had an ability to understand what our appropriate cost recovery would be. Now, I fully appreciate the point that's being made, and it's been made in a number of different forums, which is that obviously there are people at different levels within the organisation, and that those people within the organisation get paid different rates. Now, the flow from that, in terms of the logic, would be that you could, and it is possible, to go through and identify the individual hours that each of those different levels contribute to any given process or license fee. Now, when we talked about cost recovery and the principles of cost recovery right at the beginning of the Public Protection Partnership, we were mindful of the legal requirements on us and the relevant case law that came through on a couple of quite prominent cases, that we needed to demonstrate what was reasonable and proportionate for any of the activities that we were undertaking where we've got an ability, discretionary fees. So in the absence of being able to carry out that detailed analysis of every single licence and every single person's involvement in each of those licences, we took a view that it was pragmatic to firstly work out what the hourly rate was and work out roughly, and it is an estimate in many respects, what the level of activity would be associated with the production and processing, and in some cases enforcement, in some cases compliance, and then put together a set of fees and charges that we believed at that time to be reasonable and proportionate. And then over time, what we've done is we've looked at individual processes, and we've broken that down to a finer level of detail, and where there's been a difference, that difference has then been reflected in an update in the fees and charges that have been presented to various committees across the three authorities. The idea being all the way through that wherever possible we be transparent and make sure that there wasn't any unreasonable burdens placed upon the businesses that we were regulating. Most recently, there were conversations with regard to particular trades that felt that the costs that were being charged, the fees that were being charged, were inappropriate and untransparent. What I've tried to do in this year's fees and charges is take forward some of those, some of that research, and look specifically at particular processes, and also to break down the components of that hourly rate to look at what the different levels of staffing are within certain processes. And a couple of sort of stark things came out of it, which is, yes, by the time we work out how much administration time goes in, all the way through to senior management time, you can more clearly identify in a transparent way how those different component parts get accumulated. However, the other conclusion is that in the main, when you add it back up, it comes close to what it was at the beginning. So there isn't, what we found was that there wasn't significant variation in the averaging out of a cost recovery rate, as opposed to having all of the different rates established and all of that put back out into the public domain. But we did undertake that process for both HMOs and animal boarding this year. So in response to public questions that were raised at the Joint Public Protection Committee earlier in the year, we established exactly what those what the what all the activities were that made up the work that led to producing those licences and the compliance and enforcement relevant to those licences. And the fees and charges that we're setting are based on those calculations. So we are entirely comfortable that the fees that we're putting forward are in substance and in spirit meeting the requirements of the LGA guidance and the case law that came out of particularly the Westminster cases that related specifically to how local authorities should be charging in reasonable and proportionate terms. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that if I could just quickly come back on that, Chair, that's really helpful, and I'm glad that the review has been done. Will that review come to this committee, though? Because we were promised that we would see the results of that.
That from my perspective, the results of that piece of work were in a direct response to public questions that went to joint committee, so they are a matter of public record. So I'm more than happy to direct the chairman and the committee to where that is located.
So has it been? So it's only been done in specific circumstances. It hasn't been done for the overall rate of 59 that is used for most of them. So
in breaking that down, what we've done is we've identified what the different layers are within the PPP, and we've identified what the rates are for those different layers. And then for the specific two areas that we were investigating for the purposes of those public questions, we've applied the logic to those two licences and we've amended them accordingly. Now, what I did say at the time, and it's on the record from a PPP service point of view, is we know that there are more discretionary fees in the system that need a review like that. but pragmatically we've had to do it in a kind of order of priority. So yes, there are still more to be done in that fashion. But what my advice would be is that I think that our legal teams reviewed what we had done up until that point and concluded that what we had done was fair and reasonable. However, for the purposes of transparency, it would aid us in the future to break it down to that level of detail for transparency purposes.
Your attention.
I mean, my only other comment on.
Go on, Rachel.
So, sorry, I was going to say my only other comment on that rate would be it's a bit surprising that it's come out the same as it was before, because I understand in terms of the organisational structure, that's actually changed quite drastically, hasn't it, in the last, say, 5 years? So you think there might be some efficiencies there, and actually the rate, if you take out inflation anyway, the rate might have actually gone down?
Well, yes, there are certain areas where efficiencies have played a part, but again, I think the thing we need to sort of bear in mind in terms of the overall cost of the service is that there are genuine pressures that create additional costs within the service, and I'm thinking primarily around the fact that the budget is essentially in its entirety split probably about 80% towards staffing, and staffing costs over the course of the time that we've been in shared services and beyond have been on the rise. So I think that in broad terms, what I would say is that we're probably we're ahead of where we would have been if we had no efficiencies in the system. But yes, there definitely has been some gradual increase in costs over the time that we've been operating the shared service. I think that's fair to say.
Okay, just to clarify, if people did come forward and say the license that they were paying they reckoned was too high, you would be happy to investigate to see whether there was any merit in that view. And the second question would be, if you did examine all the licenses across the board, there would be a significant cost, and that cost presumably would have to be borne by the licence payers. Would that be right?
I think yes to the first question, Chairman, which is we, as far as I'm concerned, whenever a specific fee has been challenged, the service has responded in a way of saying, yes, we believe this fee is reasonable and proportionate. We will have another look at it, and those conclusions have tended to be brought to a committee somewhere along the line. And then on the second point, the issues around sorry, Chris, can you just remind me what the second part of your question was?
So if you were to do a complete analysis of all the licenses across the board, there would be a cost there, and that cost would ultimately be borne by the licence payers.
Yes. So the principles that I would point to for people who may want to look into this in a bit more detail is that there is a document that's cited within Sean's report that in the appendices, which is a LGA guidance document on how local authorities should work out cost recovery, and it's quite clear in that it is not just about the direct service that the person who's paying the fee receives. It's the entire framework that sits behind how that service is provided. So in those terms, yes, if we had to spend significant amount of time researching, developing, analysing the individual licence fees at length, by definition, that work comes into the terms of cost recovery. So again, the balance that we've tried to strike over the course of time has been one of when we benchmark ourselves against other local authorities, when we talk to people about the fees we're setting, is there anything that jumps out at us as being manifestly unreasonable? If the answer to that is yes, then we need to look at it in a bit more detail. But yes, there's had to be some prioritisation around how we do that process.
Okay, thank you. Rachel, are you okay with those answers? If you are.
Yeah, I do have a few other questions, but I'll let someone else have a chance first.
Have a second bite later.
Yep.
Abdul's the next one. Abdul?
Thank you, Chris. Page 14, 1.4. I just want to know how do you came to 0.6 rises? And the second question, is this throughout all three local authority or just Workingham?
This is a cost of living increase.
Yeah.
Yeah. Chair, if I may answer that, so some fees are based on the hourly rate and some just have an inflationary increase. So things like private water supplies and things like that. The 0.6% was the inflationary level at that time when those fees were basically set. So inflation, is relatively low at the moment, and that's where the 0.6% came from for those fees which are just rise by inflation.
Thank you. Abdul, okay with that? I'll move on to Lindsay, please. Lindsay.
Thank you. I'll make an observation first to the response that I think Paul gave just now. If we had a lot of people up in arms about our fees, and it was found that we were high and it was quite expensive for some reason, I think it would be unacceptable to complain and make the people who complained about the high charges pay. But I do accept that if we were getting a lot of people just asking to check the figures and such like, and being a sort of a nuisance effect, then having that approach would stop them doing it. But I think the issue for me on that is whether it's a legitimate complaint about the price and charges as against something where it's okay. So I just make that observation, and I do think they should be treated separately. I've got some questions about on the taxi side. Are we covering that at this part, or is that in the next one? I get confused with which anyone, but I'll ask about it.
The first recommendation, which is covering the whole of
the whole thing.
Appendix C.
We've got a number of areas in our licence and fees where the people involved are having severe problems, and the taxi side is one. I've spoken to quite a few of the taxi drivers, particularly those who use Twyford Station, and they estimate that they're around about 15 to 20% of their revenue as to what they used to get. I don't know what financial support they're getting from the government on that, but what's our view regarding trying to still charge the full fees when a lot of people are having severe financial problems? Because quite a few of them have said to me that they're thinking of handing their badge in.
Chair, if I may pick that up, clearly, obviously, Councillor Ferris, it's a matter for the council in terms of the fee level that it sets up to the cost recovery based fee. So the fees that are before are the fees that that the Joint Committee have recommended, but clearly it is a matter for the council if they wish to charge less than the fee that's proposed. In effect, basically some degree of subsidy, and like we had really over the last 2 years, where we had a phasing of the increase of fee, as you will probably recall.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why this is really before this committee tonight, to have that discussion.
So does this committee have that authority to do that?
It doesn't have the authority to set the fee. It does have the authority, of course, to recommend to the next stage of the fee setting process. Would be my understanding.
Then, as I'm speaking, I would like to recommend that those areas, and I don't think it's exclusive to taxi area, but it certainly does apply. I would like to recommend that we need to take account on our fees associated with the financial impact that's happening with the taxi people, because I see taxis sat outside Twyford not taking any business for hours on end, whereas they were taking a steady flow of people all the time. And I think it's pretty general across the board, wherever they're located, whether in the centre of Wokingham or in wherever, their business has been significantly impacted. And if we're not careful, we may not end up with a taxi service in future if we don't do something. So I would recommend that I would say that this committee should put through to, as it goes to the exec, is it, that we need to take account of those areas where we know that there's financial problems and take due account of it during the pandemic period. And I'm only talking about the pandemic period, because outside, when this finishes, so they should then start getting their business back. But I'd like to understand that. So that's my views on the taxi side. I have a question on the dog boarders side of things. I have 3 dogs at home, and quite a lot of people help their neighbours out looking after the dogs. And 1 or 2 people do it as a sort of semi-hobby, where they do charge, but they don't do it as a sort of main business. How are they treated? Because if I look at the fees, there's some fairly large, significant fees. I can understand it for somebody who's got a business where they've got people and they're taking multiple dogs every week and such like. I have no problem with that. But what I'm talking about is that sort of non-professional side of things, which quite a lot of people are dependent on.
Okay, I'll just make the observation that there are a lot of businesses in the borough just struggling due to the pandemic. It's not just taxi drivers.
No, I know that. That's what I just said.
Whatever we did in subsidising the fees that they have to pay, I don't think it would make that much of a difference. It'd be welcome, but whether it would make the difference between them being unable to trade and continuing to trade, perhaps doubtful. But I listen to other members, but perhaps Sean, can you just explain how the animal boarding works with what you might call casual, not done for profit?
Chair, I will probably invite Paul, if I may, again to talk about the fees, because Paul was heavily involved in writing the paper for the Joint Committee on that element of it. What I would say is that the regulations that came in 2018, Councillor Ferris, I think probably it's fair to say did that they completely rebuilt the kind of regulatory framework around all animal welfare establishments, including basically animal boarding. And significantly increase basically the parameters under which basically they were assessed, as well as basically setting regular requirements around things like inspections and timetables, and also a risk-based system. In terms of what's captured into as being believed to be effectively somebody in business as opposed to somebody that's a hobby, Julia, can you remind me? Maybe if you could come in here. I think basically they did set some indication as to what they believed to be basically somebody in trade, didn't they, in the guidance?
Well, there's a business case, Chairman. So if somebody doesn't earn more than £1,000, then they wouldn't be classed as a business, and so wouldn't have to pay so much of a fee. They could act as a sort of a hobby host, if you like.
Yeah, I thought it was that. So in effect, basically, so that would capture most people within this. And of course, it wasn't just people who did things like home boarding. It was also people who did in the past what would be considered to be kind of hobby breeding, that type of thing as well. In relation to the fees for home boarding, obviously, you've got basically a proposal before you tonight, which sets out a basis for the calculation of that fee. Part of which is administrative, part of which is either the initial inspection for a new applicant or an inspection basically for a renewal. And what we're basically proposing is that is the fee for the grant of a licence for either a renewal or a new licence. And then there will be a cost. So currently those inspections are carried out, the vast majority of them are carried out for us. Basically on contract at the moment, and the proposal is that where subsequent inspections are required, and some of them are required by law in certain circumstances, or because we need to carry out additional revisits, that they will be charged at the actual cost of that inspection. So that's the new basis of fees. But Paul, do you want to just add? I know you did a lot of the work on this. Do you want to just talk through the schedule on animal fee orders in particular?
Yeah, thank you. I guess, in adding to that, what I would say is that the principles are very solidly based around risk, and the conversations that have been had from the trade, I've had directly with a number of traders over the course of previous months. The purpose of expanding on the transparency of these fees is that previous styles of serving and setting these fees has been based on capturing a wide variety of different permutations of what may or may not be required to issue a licence, to ensure compliance with the standards of that licence, to make sure that if there are any people out there that are unscrupulous enough to carry out licensable activities, what level of enforcement do we want to take? And all of that gets put into the mix to create a single fee. Now, what was put forward in a coherent and comprehensive sort of debate was that the traders felt that there were some quite small businesses that got caught up in all of that, and that some of the fees that had been set were disproportionate for the amount of burden that they placed on us as a service, and therefore cost recovery, when you do it in a generic sense, was seen to be unfair. So we took that on board and looked at different models and looked at the way that the guidance was composed from the LGA, and we reprofiled it that said something along the lines of, if you come to us and you need the first step, which is essentially to administer and process the paperwork, the commissioning of the contractor to go out and do the inspection, to make sure that all the paperwork is appropriately managed and that the overall system is robust. That requires a certain amount of cost, but it was a lot less than the total fee. And then certainly in current circumstances, one of the things that was, again, a valid point that was put forward is that we as a service aspire to go out and visit all of those premises, and that there was a cost associated with that visit. But on some occasions, those visits weren't able to happen for one reason or another. And what was happening is that these small businesses were outlaying money up front for a visit that they may or may not get. So what we agreed was that the methodology could improve its transparency by saying, right, the front end administrative paperwork processing of the licence is one charge, and then as and when visits are needed, and that will be based on the risk profile, the nature of any complaints that might come forward, and any enforcement work that we might need to do, would be then chargeable to those businesses as and when those costs were incurred. So it was seen as a much more fair and transparent way of spreading that cost to the businesses that genuinely incur the costs for us as an authority. And the trade, when I spoke to them about that process, seemed entirely happy with that approach. And it as I say, it improves the transparency of what we're trying to do. Okay, you've neatly gone into recommendation 3, which is fine. I think we've actually covered most of that. But Linton, do you want to come back on that?
Thank you. No, I think that was clear. I think that's a good point that was made there, because the smaller ones, there was some issue, and I noticed that was being dealt with. And I think the answer of the £1,000 per annum, I think covers a lot of the ones who do it sort of just to do any. If I lose out, I've got a message to say I'm about to lose my VPN connection. So if I go off, I'll have to come back on. I think I'm okay on that. Just going back to my earlier point there, Chris, I'm making an issue. I know about what's specifically happening with the taxis, and there's no question about it. Their business is significantly down, and I don't know what extra financial support we're getting. My comment would be is if we carry on asking for the fees that we're asking for, we might end up getting 100% of nothing, because if they hand their licenses in and not pursue it, then we're not going to get any income anyway. So I think that we need to think about, and all I would be asking is that we might, if we're going to the exec, is to say to the exec, if there's areas in our area that are affected in the licence area and fees area, which are financially and significantly affected, and I agree it's more than just taxis, then if the exec has got that flexibility in what they deal with to help out, then that would be what I would suggest, and see if that would be acceptable to the rest of the meeting here.
Okay, I don't know whether that's a proposal or what, because the executive can do what they like. They have the power over us.
Well, yes, they can, but we could make some proposals to them.
We could. Well, I think you made a perfectly reasonable proposal. Luciano, do you think, do we just send that forward? Do we need to vote on that? It seems a perfectly sensible thing to put forward. Yes?
Chair, one option, I guess, is to amend the recommendation that that effectively, if you look at recommendation, I guess, would be recommendation. Sorry, I'm just looking back to papers 1. That you could put a rider on there that basically that the committee, for example, recognises the impact of the current economic conditions caused by the pandemic, and ask the executive to consider the fees in that context, or some wording around that. Is that what you're looking at?
That's the sort of thing. Yes, I'm only talking about this particular period that we've got.
Yeah, we're only talking about licensing. I think the executive has a wider view.
Yeah.
So if you're happy with what Sean has just suggested, I'm happy to second your proposal, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Amend the first 1.1 first recommendation. Okay.
Thank
Still
you.
with us? Okay, so I'll move on to Bill Soames. Evening, Bill.
Good evening. Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to be specific on page 31, only because I've been approached a little while ago by a guy who operates an ice cream business within the area of Early, and the fees that we are charging per vehicle of £717.28 for a 6-month period seems rather excessive. And can we justify that cost based on an hourly cost of £59 per hour? It seems you've got to do an awful lot of work to justify that on one vehicle, and he's finding it extremely difficult. Bearing in mind they've got 6 months, that's for a 6-month licence, and he only operates really for 6 months as a road. Or how can I say that as of yesterday, we had a rogue ice cream vehicle in our area. I don't know whether they're licensed or at this time of the year, but is that happening? Thank you.
Chair, if I could pick up the second point, and I'll probably, because I again, when it comes to the licensing of street traders and ice cream vehicles, Paul has got the badge for that one. But if I could pick up the second point, certainly what I can say is where we have had allegations across our area, basically across the public protection area, of unlicensed activity with ice cream sellers, we have actually looked into that. And I mean, Julie, you may be able to update, but I think we've actually dealt with some incidences of that. Okay, I've lost.
Sorry. Oh. Sorry, I was just trying to check the fees in the other West Berkshire side. Yes, we have. We've received several complaints of unlicensed street traders, and we do go out and look for them. Obviously, they're not the easiest thing to find with an ice cream vehicle that travels around, but yeah, we do spend quite a lot of time doing that.
It says against that contract only in the last.
Yeah, and what I would do, Councillor Soames, is I would always basically encourage traders, and it doesn't really matter whether it is traders in street trading sector or whether it's basically animal licensed traders, whether to report matters to us if they do actually believe that there are unlicensed traders operating in the area, because we do get allegations of this, and we do look into these things quite seriously. So if I could hand over to Paul on the issue of street trading fees, Paul, I know you did a lot of work on this in the past.
Yes, there are a couple of key things that need to be borne in mind in relation to street trading, which is that we do have an awful lot of history of requiring to do compliance and enforcement of unlicensed traders, which again does give rise to increased costs. However, one of the things that I would say is that street trading hasn't been subject to a detailed review in the same way as animal boarding and the HMOs that have been reviewed this year. So in terms of areas where there might be a justifiable reason to do some further work, I would see it being reasonable that street traders is on that list. Not to suggest that the fee that we've set is unreasonable, but just because it hasn't been reviewed for a little while, that may well be one that we want to focus in on. I think the key thing to bear in mind in relation to street trading, of course, is that it requires a number of things to be checked. It's not purely a case of being handed a bit of paper and then the person goes off and trades. There are a number of compliance checks, and as I say, the enforcement side of things is quite significant.
Why did it say Bracknell only in the last column? What does that mean? I mean, there's no fee for Wokingham and West Berkshire.
That's a good question, Chair. I can't see why it would be a Bracknell only, because we haven't got an alternative. I'm just looking. Okay. I understand now. Yeah, go on, Sean. So I'll leave it to you.
I was just going to say that street trading is the one area where fees aren't aligned across the three authorities. Because of the nature of Bracknell Town Centre, they have different fees.
So where is the Wokingham fee? If that's the Bracknell fee.
Sorry, I need...
It's captured under the general heading of street trading, Chairman. So whereas in Bracknell they've separated it out to incorporate ice cream vans as a specific line, our West Berkshire and Wokingham's are all captured under street trading consents, which is in the block above.
I see. They're the same thing in Wokingham.
Yes.
You just get a street traders consent on your way. I see. Okay. Thank you. Rachel, back to you.
Thank you very much. Just on the animal borders, so this is page 20. I can see that you've managed to reduce the amount of time by 2 hours for 21-22. But I also know that the 570, the original fee, was actually a sharp increase on the previous year. I think we didn't really see that last year when we were looking at it because the methodology had changed. So the comparative wasn't actually that clear. But I know it was quite a big increase. There was an article in the press that said that there was a meeting in September of the PPP where it was agreed that that fee would be reduced, which was surprising to me because it wasn't obviously something that this committee had talked about. So I'm a bit confused about what that related to, whether that was 2021 or 21-22, and also in terms of what you're asking us to agree, because the recommendation says 2020-21, whereas I thought we were looking at the fees for 21-22.
Okay. I can answer that, Chairman, if you like.
Please, Paul.
Okay, yeah, so, yes, what happened was that we set the if you like, the ball in motion for a full debate on fees and charges as part of the budget in the earlier Joint Public Protection Committee. And then as a result of those papers going public, specific public questions were asked of us in relation to home boarding and HMOs. The request around review of the 570 fee related to in-year costs and next year's fees and charges. So what essentially we did as a service, we looked at what we felt the actual cost to the service was of processing those licences in year, and we took a view on what that needed to be. And the accepted position was that we had based the £570 on 10 hours of work as an estimate on the grounds that we were still, if you like, finding our way through the new legislation and how that would play out with the trade. The trade came back to us and pointed out certain truths, which were because of COVID, they weren't receiving any visits. They'd paid this money out up front, and that they felt that as a small business that was unfair. We accepted that position, and what we did was we said publicly and stated clearly that any businesses that had been charged that £570 would be refunded the difference of any work that hadn't been conducted. So that made sure that no small business was out of pocket and that the cash flows returned to them, because that was a fair point. The other element of it was that we looked at what it would what it would take us as a service to provide the activities that needed to be undertaken to issue those licenses, and we felt that in general terms that we could reduce that by 2 hours, which gave us, if you like, a multiplier of the current hourly rate and eight hours. So that gave a number for us to work on. What also was true was that because at the time we didn't have available staff to conduct that work, we'd sought a contractor to do that work on our behalf, and there was a difference between what they were charging us for that work and what we would have charged if we'd have done it ourselves. And again, that debate was had publicly, and we said it was only right and proper, in light of the transparency that we were seeking, that we would literally pass on any costs that were charged to us by the contractor to the business direct, and there would be no additional charges from us. So again, that's where, if you like, another permutation in the fees came through in year. And so what we've ended up with is a commitment to the trade that says we will charge you what it costs us to administer the process, and we will add on to that charge whatever the contractor charges us to deliver that service to make sure that your licence is maintained appropriately. And if into future years we continue to use those contractors and they continue to be the best, most cost-effective way to do it, excuse me, then that process will continue until such time as we need to do something different. Because obviously it makes no sense if we can find a contractor to provide that service for cheaper than we can do it, then that's the cost that should be passed on to the business. And that's the commitment that we've made to the trade, which they're happy with, obviously, because it's cheaper. And then the last sort of element of it is, if at any point in the future, when we review the amount of work that goes into supporting that trade, whether it be through compliance, administration or enforcement, we can then update the committee accordingly with a time recording and an evidence base to say this is why we're proposing a change in the future.
Okay, so the recommendation, I mean, the in-year changes have already been agreed, so the recommendation, should that read next year rather than this year?
Yes, the recommendation for this meeting is about next year's fees and charges, but I think it is just worth bearing in mind that, yes, the recommendations that went through at joint committee did include recommendations to essentially retrofit the position for in-year as well.
Sorry, Chair. I think if I could just add, so Councillor Burgess is right. Actually, the recommendation should read that it should apply this year as well as basically for 21-22. So just on that point, Councillor Burgess, what we did do is when these points were initially raised by the trade, actually we suspended collecting fees at that point, pending this review that has just been conducted that Paul has referred to, and I know that Paul's had a lot of discussion with the trade. So that there are very few, I think, that are actually charged at the very highest rate of the 570. But the plan would be basically to refund those people where basically for any activity, as Paul has said, that hasn't happened for whatever reason in this year. And then going forward, the fee that is proposed is the one that is in the schedule, which I believe, if I can find this, is around about 270 or so for a new licence, 240 for a renewal, and basically any additional visits charged at cost. So if those visits are carried out by our contractor, then they'll just be charged the cost of that visit.
Yeah. Is that okay? So the third recommendation is referring to the retrospective fitting of the fee for 21-22.
Yeah, so sorry, the first recommendation does deal with the fee for 21-22 because that is the fees. The third recommendation is effectively what that's saying is that effectively the fee in relation to animal boarding basically applies this year as well. I think is what that's the way that it's set out.
Yeah, that's right. Rachel, should I comment on that?
Yeah, that sounds fine. That's understood. I just had a couple of questions on the taxi side of things. Just wanted to check. You'll remember in our meeting towards the end of 2019, we agreed that the very large increases to taxi fees would be phased in over 3 years. Can I just check that that's now run its course? Because I would have thought this was year 3 of that, or Have those discounts already all been applied?
So we applied, yes. We applied basically at I think it was £80 last year. We applied £40 this year, and next year would have been the first fee of the full fee. So last year it was £80 cheaper in Woking and the other two authorities. It was 40 this year.
Yeah.
And obviously basically going forward, and I guess this comes back to the point that Councillor Ferris has made as well, going forward.
Yeah, and can I just check on the private hire? So that's a licence for 5 years, but am I right that they could pay annually if they wish to?
Yes. So what we've said is that effectively we would break that down and they could pay annually for that. Okay. So we have a 5-year fee effectively, because that originally was the way that the whole trade was moving, but clearly in the current climate, it's right that they're given the option to pay annually. Okay,
and the recommendations talk about consultation. So how will we do that consultation with the taxi drivers, and how will we make sure that is genuinely meaningful consultation?
Yeah, so there is basically there is a statutory requirement to consult on taxi vehicle fees. So that's taxi and private hire vehicles and on private hire operator fees. I mean, the statutory element of that consultation is that basically it's done with the by placing the public notices and all of that kind of stuff that we've had in the past. But in fact, going forward, I mean, what we would do is to write to them all, basically all of those affected licence holders, and seek representations. And I think traditionally what's happened where representations have been made, they would normally come back, I think, am I right in thinking, Julia, to this committee?
Yes, they would go from, once the fees have been agreed by the executive, they would go out for the statutory consultation and obviously what we're doing by letter and email, and then that would have to go back to probably the executive as well, because they're the ones that set the final fees before full council.
But traditionally, where there have been representations, I'm pretty sure we've brought them back. So effectively, so that would be the process. So the fees would be, whenever they're set, formally set, we will then go out to the statutory consultation period, and we'll bring back any basically consultation responses. Obviously, they will need to go back to the relevant fee-setting body, the council, the executive. But I think traditionally we've always brought them back here, and that's how I think the whole debate came up about the taxi fees in the first case.
Okay, thank you.
We did this last year, and I think it came back to the January 2020 meeting.
I think that's right.
But we can't go to consultation till the executive meeting, but that's going to be fairly soon anyway. So it'll be the result. The executive might change the taxi fees, possibly. So if they amend them, we will obviously consult on what they've amended, and then come back in January 2021.
Okay, just one last quick one, if that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, of course it is.
It's just there was some controversy in the summer about fitness instructors. Now they're not listed. Unless I'm missing it, I can't see them on the list here. Is that because there's no charge for them, or why are they not on the list?
It's not a matter for this committee, and I think in the end, I do recall that. I think in the end that fee was held back anyway. It was another section. It was another part of the council. I think was looking at that, wasn't it, in relation to parks? It was fitness instructors in parks, as I recall.
Yeah, that's right. So that's for us too.
So that's not a matter for this committee. Yeah.
But do we issue licences to those instructors?
No. I guess it was a charge for using the public space. But no, there is no. We don't license them.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Lindsay, second vice the chair. Dogs very quiet tonight, Lindsay.
Yes, they are. I'm surprised. Talking on the dogs, I listened to the explanation that was just given to Rachel's question. I got a little bit confused as to what we are proposing for the current 2021, because they've got the figures in the table, and we've got the 2021 figures in the table. I just had them when I moved them, and I was wondering if they're not being visited. We've agreed to reduce them for this year because we're not been going and visiting them, if that's the case. And as a result of, it's almost links, as you say, it links closely to what I was saying about this year because there's the impact we're having. In this instance, it's what we're not doing because we're not visiting on that. So have we got clarity as to what they're being charged in 2021? And is it the same as what is being proposed for 21-22?
I believe
yes, it is a reduced fee, yes. So everybody would have had one initial visit to be licensed, I believe, Julia, because they can't be licensed without that one initial visit because they need to have their risk assessment. I mean, the other thing actually that we haven't said about the animal fees, which I think is important. So these fees basically are the fee for however long the license lasts, whether that's 1, 2 or 3 years. So with the fees that are proposed across the piece, clearly what we would really like people to do, we would like to work with all operators to get to the maximum length of license of 3 years. I mean, that's good for the operator, but it's good for the user of the service. It's also good for the animals, because what that means is they've got the highest welfare standards and the highest levels of compliance. So what we're really hoping is over time that more and more of the people will shift into that 3-year bracket. And then, of course, if you look at the fees and spread over 3 years, you're not talking, for example, a home boarder at much more than that 240 plus whatever the secondary inspection is would be your fee for 3 years.
And the whole purpose of the legislation is to protect the animals, is it not?
Yes, I mean it was a significant change. I mean I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think basically the original legislation that dealt with home boarding, Julia, went back to what, the 50s?
50s or 60s, yes.
Yeah. So it was a significant change, and I think that was part of the issues here that I think we all know much more about the regulations now and the implementation of those, whether it's us, whether it's the home boarders themselves, whether it's the people doing the inspections. And I think what we're finding all the time is that, and what we would hope to find all the time is that basically as we go forward, that levels of compliance increase, people's star ratings increase, the length of license increases, and that effectively the costs come down for everybody as a result of that.
Good. Thank you.
Are you okay? Right.
Yeah.
On the agenda. Right. The three. I think we've covered the three recommendations now. There's an amendment to recommendation 1 by Lindsay. I seconded. Luciana, did you get the text of that amendment?
I think I did, Chair. Let me just go back on my notes.
Sean actually composed it.
There was something. The wording was that the committee urges the exec to recognize the difficulties, and I only have written half a sentence, but.
I think what the committee was, if my take is right, Chairman, what the committee was saying is that basically the committee, in recommending the fees to the exec, or asked the executive to consider the impact, basically the current economic conditions caused by the pandemic on the trade, on the various aspects of the licensed trade. I guess that's what we're saying, is a wording to that effect.
That's right.
Yes, okay. Yeah, okay. Lots of members are happy with understand what we're voting on. So I think, has anyone else got their hand up? Switching windows here. Nobody's got their hand up. So I think we can go to the vote. Shall I take them separately? So we've got 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. Can I just call the numbers out? Everyone's got them in front of them. So can I take 1.1 as amended? Can those in favour please show?
Hands up.
I don't know why I can't see my hand to raise it. I think that's unanimous.
No, I would like it recorded that I want to vote against this, please.
You would? Oh, sorry, Rachel. Okay, I'm voting in favour. I can't see where my hand. Okay, so I'm voting in favour. So that is carried with Rachel voting against. 1.2 is to approve the consultation on whatever the executive decide for the taxi and private hire vehicle fees. Can I See those in favour? That looks like a lot of hands. Is that everybody? I think it is. And again, I don't know why I don't seem to have a hand to raise here. It's rather strange. But I think that's everybody, isn't it? So that is approved. So we take your hands down again. And then 1.3 was agreeing the methodology for the animal boarding fees calculation. Big show on that as well. I will vote for that. And that looks like, just shout out if you didn't vote, it looks unanimous to me. Thank you very much. So that's the end of that. So the annual report, we discussed this last time, but it's been amended slightly by request from members. Sean, can you explain what's happened here, please?
Changed from the last time is updated the figures. Do you remember there were figures that didn't make a lot of sense in terms of the numbers of licenses for each year? I mean, there was always going to be disparities between each year because some licenses are obviously 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. So that was the other amendment. I've actually now also got some figures around the number of service requests. Actually, this was going to be presented by my colleague who unfortunately hasn't been able to make it tonight. But looking at the
one that asked the question why there were so many big differences over the years.
Yeah. I think. I mean, we have checked and double checked this now, haven't we, Julia, on those figures?
Yeah, and some of it seems to be how the data has been recorded. But you were quite right, Councillor Richards. When we looked at it, there couldn't possibly be zero in some of the figures. It just made no sense at all. But some of them, when you certainly look at years, is why there might not have been applications for several years because new legislation has come in and has altered that. So hopefully they look better now.
So you've been through them and checked them all, so reasonably confident that the numbers that will now appear will look reasonable and correct.
Well, they certainly look more reasonable, so hopefully you think so too.
Rachel, you want to come in? Rachel?
No, that's fine, Chair. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. So no comments on that. So, well, I'll take a vote on those. Those in favour of supporting that, please show. Okay, sorry, I got muted there on my phone. I think that's unanimous.
No, sorry, Chair. I would like to vote against that for the reasons outlined at the last meeting that are recorded in the minutes of the last meeting.
Okay, sorry, Rachel. I wasn't trying to avoid that. But I'm just disappearing off the bottom of my screen. So, okay, so the last item is the forward programme. Sean, I think you need to say something about that paper you sent around today about taxes.
Sorry, Chairman. We had one of the issues that was raised last time was the history, really, I suppose, and the questions that have been raised by the taxi trade around the 48-inch access height restriction on basically disabled wheelchair accessible vehicles. We have a background paper basically which we did produce. I'm sorry it got circulated today, but we've done a bit of work on that. As you can see, Karen has done quite a bit of work on that in terms of research and everything else. I guess the question is that something that basically in light of that this committee really wants to bring back to consider in more detail? So this is a matter that has been raised by the trade. Is this something that the committee wishes to be brought back?
Barry.
It's not on that particular item that I want to talk about. I wanted to talk about another issue regarding the forward plan.
Oh, fine. Okay, I'll come back to you in a moment. Bill, you've got your hand up. Is this about this item? Bill?
I was saying that I think this, sorry, I was muted. I think this should come back, and I think it's something that needs to be finalised as far as the trade's concerned. It's gone on for a long time, and I think we need some concrete results on it.
Check. Would you like us to bring that paper back in January then?
If it's, yes, if we're okay to discuss that, then we can make a decision. I think you had 3 alternatives possible.
Okay, yeah, okay. We will bring forward a paper in January then with the background and some recommendations.
Okay.
Options, I should say, yeah.
Yeah, Lindsay?
Yes, the thing that well, I was involved heavily. I think a number of us on the committee here who were there then who were involved with going through what we did last time. The message that I get from the taxi drivers I've spoken to is that they want to have a clear understanding and that it's consistent so that they know what the position is, because what they don't want is it keep changing. So we need to have something which they clearly understand, and then when we do decide it, if that we're going to review it, is we stick with it, because they need to plan ahead, and they will be, it's what vehicles there are around and what they do and they go about, and they're paying quite considerable sums of money for these vehicles, and they don't want to suddenly find that they've got a vehicle that's not suitable for whatever reason, and that's what their main concerns are. And I think it also goes both ways, that if they've got a height and somebody is getting away with something, taxi drivers were complaining about somebody who had managed to get through things or something. It applies both ways, so it's for them to sort that out. But what I think the main message is whatever we get to, we need to make sure we then stick with it, because when they buy a vehicle or lease a vehicle or whatever, they are going to want it for a number of years, and they want to know that it's appropriate. That's the message I've received.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely reasonable. I'm sure we'll aim to achieve that. Some other points there. Barry, would you like to raise your other point?
Yes, my situation is that in the past I've talked about environmental health and trading standards, which is sort of something that's in PPP, which we haven't heard about. And I did mention in the past that perhaps we should get some updates on that occasionally. And it seems to me that there are sort of a hidden area that we never get anything said about, but it relates so closely to licensing. And particularly as it's the PPP that actually looks after that. But in fact, there are only 2 people from our authority that are going to the PPP, and that's only meeting 3 monthly. So the opportunity to discuss all the things that relate to that. I mean, I've got a list of here of some of the things that is claiming to be done, and that's frameworking projects, organising crime groups, vulnerable adults, modern day slavery, doorstep crime, poor housing standards, air pollution, unsafe food, children's obesity, alcohol and tobacco consumption, and the list goes on. It just seems that there's an awful lot there which we never hear anything about, and it would be helpful if we could just have an update occasionally with regards to that.
Okay, Sean?
Chairman, if I may, I think the point that Councillor Patman makes is a good point, in the sense of a lot of the work of the rest of trading standards, environmental health, do touch actually on the work of licensing as well. So the kind of things that have been talked about there, like safeguarding and all of those other issues, can I propose that for the next meeting that I come back actually with a presentation.
You're frozen, I think.
Oh, yeah. Sean wants to make back a presentation on the PPP, I think.
Yeah, what I was going to say was that in light of the point that Councillor Patman has made, what I was going to say was I'm very happy to come back to the next committee meeting and to give a presentation on the wider work of the Public Protection Service and actually the interconnections between the wider work and things like and things like the work of this committee. So, for example, if you take trading standards to work around underage sales and youth alcohol and things like that. So I'm very happy to come back if that's the will of the committee.
I would have thought probably that wouldn't come back to a committee meeting. It would be a separate
briefing.
Separate briefing that you've done before. When we used to have real meetings, non-virtual meetings. Do members agree with that? Lynn's got his hand up.
Yes. Chair, I agree with what Councillor Patton has been saying. When I first got onto the Borough Council, and I thought licensing would be very interesting, covering a whole range of things, I found that in reality the committees deal with about 3 things, which is taxis, odd licensing things for restaurants or whatever, and dogs. But there must be dozens of different types of licenses and permits and all sorts of things. I would love to know what they all are and who deals with them. Is it an officer? Is it an external body? Is it the police, or is it us? You know, a list of all the things you do rather than just the 3 things that seem to get on our committee meetings. So I agree with what Councillor Patton was asking. Presentation.
I think this really is out of the competence of this committee. So if you like, I can bring this meeting to an end and we can carry on to discuss what you'd like to happen. I don't think the trading standards and environmental health are not part of the licensing committee, but they are, members clearly are interested in having a presentation. So can I draw this meeting to a close and we can carry on having discussed when we've cancelled the streaming. Does anybody else want to raise any points? Lindsay and Malcolm, I think you've spoken. Nobody else wishes to raise anything. So that's the agenda. That's the end of the agenda. I think I have no extra items to discuss. So if you're happy, I'll bring the formal meeting to an end at this point. And can we now stop the end streaming, please? Thank you. So.